She had a trunk, a marriage paper signed by a man she'd never met, and 4 days of dust ground into the hem of her good dress. That was all. The stage left her standing in the yard like a parcel nobody had paid the freight on, and I watched from the corral fence the way you watch a storm you can't do anything about, already knowing she didn't know yet. Knowing she'd come 2,000 miles to marry a man who'd been 3 weeks in the ground. I figured she'd cry. I figured she'd climb back on the next coach and go. What I didn't figure, what none of us figured, was that a woman who'd lost everything she came for would sit down at a supper table that night and quietly tear up every rule the whole territory lived by. One meal. One stubborn, terrifying act of plain kindness. And by the time the lamp guttered out, the people in that house weren't who they'd been at sundown. This is the story of the bride who never got married, and the family she made anyway. My name is Eli Marsh, and I wrote down every bit of it the only way I knew how, so I wouldn't lose it the way I've lost most things worth keeping. It came rolling off the flats the way it always does in late August, a low brown wall that swallows the fence line and makes the chickens go quiet, and the stage drove right into the front edge of it as it pulled into the Renner yard. I had a tally book open on my knee. I keep one. Always have. Numbers being the only things in my life that have ever stayed put. And I'd been counting the brood hens for the 3rd time that week because counting calms me, and the place had not been calm in a month. I marked down 19. Then the coach door swung and a woman stepped out into the grit, and I forgot the 20th hen entirely. She was younger than I'd pictured. Silas had said a widow, sensible age. In that letter he'd had the schoolteacher help him write, and I'd built a picture of someone weathered and certain. This was neither. She was maybe 27, slight through the shoulders, with a traveling dress that had started out gray and finished the journey the color of the road. She held a carpetbag against her stomach with both arms like it was the last warm thing in the world. And she stood there in the yard turning her head toward the house, toward the barn, toward the line of cottonwoods down by the wash, looking for the one face she'd crossed a continent to find. I knew the moment she didn't see it, because something in her went still. The driver pitched her trunk down off the boot. It hit the hard ground with a sound like a closed door. He didn't linger. Drivers never do at the Renner place any more, word travels, and he was up and gone in a turn of dust before she'd so much as gotten her bearings, and then it was just her, and the wind and me on the fence pretending I hadn't been starring. "Ma'am," I said because somebody had to. She turned. She had a way of looking at you straight on that I wasn't used to in a woman out here where mostly folks have learned to look at the ground and let men do the deciding. "I'm looking for Mr. Silas Renner," she said. Her voice was steady, tired clean through but steady. "I believe he's expecting me. I'm Cora Wickham. Cora Renner, I suppose, before the day's out." And she gave a small laugh at her own joke, the kind people give when they're frightened and trying not to show it. There are moments a man would trade his whole right hand to hand off to somebody else. This was one. I climbed down off the fence slow on account of my knee, and I took my hat off, which she read for what it was before I'd said a word. I watched her face change, watched the steadiness in it crack, just at the corners like ice on a trough come the first cold morning. "He's gone, ma'am," I said. 3 weeks back. Fever took him, came on him fast. He was up haying one day and down the next, and on the 5th day he didn't wake. We buried him under the cottonwoods. I'm sorry, I surely am." She didn't fall. I'll give her that for the rest of my days. She did not fall. She stood in that yard with the dust settling on her shoulders and her good dress and the carpetbag she still hadn't put down, and she looked at the house, and then at the trunk on the ground, and then at me, and what she said was, "Then I don't know why I'm here." It wasn't a question, it was just the truth landing. I should tell you about the Renner place, so you'll understand the shape of what came after. Silas Renner had built it up from nothing, a 4-room house of squared logs and adobe, a good barn, a spring that ran most of the year, and a couple hundred head of mixed cattle on graze that ran clear back to the foothills. He'd come out with a wife, Esther, who I knew only a little before the consumption took her, and he'd been left with 2 children and a piece of country that demanded more hands than a grieving man had. He hired me on for the cattle. But the house needed a different kind of keeping, and that's where I have to tell you about Nolan. She'd been there longer than me. Apache, Chiricahua, though I didn't learn the right word for it for a long while, and I'll be honest that for the first year I didn't think to ask. The territory in those days had a way of teaching you to put people in 2 piles, the ones you counted and the ones you didn't, and a man could go his whole life never noticing he was doing it. Silas had taken her on after the troubles down south scattered her people, some killed, some run off to the reservation lands, some just gone in the way the word covered a great deal of cruelty without ever once saying it plain. She kept the house. She cooked, she mended. She raised those 2 children near enough by herself after Esther passed, and she did it in a household that fed her after everyone else had eaten and gave her a cot in the lean off the kitchen. Not because Silas was a hard man, but because that was simply how it was done, and nobody including me had ever thought hard enough about it to be ashamed. Nolan spoke English when she chose to. She had a way of going quiet around strangers that wasn't dullness. I came to understand it was a kind of watching, the watching of somebody who'd learned the hard way what people are capable of and had decided to see them coming. She had a daughter once. I knew that much. I never knew what became of the girl, and I never had the standing to ask, and I have carried the not asking like a stone. The children were Wesley, who was 9 and angry in the bewildered way of boys who have lost too much too young, and little June, who was 6 and had taken to following Nolan around the kitchen like a duckling holding fistfuls of her skirt. And then there was Hetty, Silas's older sister, come out from Ohio the year before to help with the children, sharp as a fence nail and twice as quick to catch you. Hetty ran the household ledger and the household opinions both, and she had been against the mail-order bride from the first, and Silas being dead had not softened her on the subject. If anything, it had given her a kind of grim satisfaction. I told him so was written all over her, even at his graveside. That was the house Cora Wickham had been delivered to like a parcel. A dead husband she'd never met, 2 grieving children, a bitter sister-in-law who wasn't even that, an Apache woman the world said she shouldn't so much as sit beside, and me, an old hand with a bad knee and a habit of writing numbers in a book. I carried her trunk inside because there was nothing else to do with it, and with her. Hetty met us at the door, and the meeting went about how I expected. "There's no money to send anyone back," Hetty said, before Cora had got both feet over the threshold, like a woman heading off an argument she'd already had 3 times in her head. "I'll say that plain so there's no misunderstanding. My brother spent what cash there was on stock and on," a flick of her eyes toward the kitchen, toward Nolan, a flick I didn't understand until later on this household, and what's left wouldn't carry a fare to Tucson, let alone back east. "So if you've come expecting to be made whole, you've come to the wrong grave." I have known Hetty to be kinder than that. I think the fear in her was talking fear of a stranger with a marriage paper that might, for all she knew, have some claim on the place that was now the only roof over those children. But Cora didn't know the fear. Cora only heard the words. She set down her carpetbag. She'd been holding it the whole time across the yard, through the door, all of it, and she set it down on the floorboards real careful, the way you set down something you've decided you don't need to clutch anymore. And she said, "I haven't asked you for anything, Miss Renner. Miss Renner, I haven't asked you for a thing and I'm not going to. I had a husband promised and now I don't. That's a grief and it's mine to carry. And I won't be making it yours." Her voice shook on the last of it, but she got it all out. "I'd be obliged for water to wash the road off and a corner to sleep tonight, and in the morning I'll see what's to be done. That's all I want from anyone under this roof." There was a silence. Out in the kitchen a spoon stopped scraping a pot. Then little June came out from behind the doorframe, 6 years old, barefoot, a smear of cornmeal on her cheek, and walked straight up to Cora and looked at her with the frank, dreadful directness only small children have, and said, "Are you our new mama?" And I watched a woman who hadn't fallen in the dust, who hadn't fallen when I took my hat off, who hadn't fallen under Hetty's hard tongue. I watched that question very nearly take her to the floor. "No, sweetheart," Cora said, kneeling down so she was eye to eye with the child, and her voice came out so gentle I had to look at my boots. "No, but I came an awful long way and I'm glad to meet you all the same. What's your name?" "June." "That's a fine name. June's the best month there is, all the long days." June considered this with the gravity of a judge. Then she took Cora's hand, just took it, the way children do, deciding to trust you before you've earned a thing, and she said, "We're having supper soon. Nolan made it. You can have some." And she towed Cora 2 steps toward the kitchen before Hetty's voice cracked across the room like a quirt. "June, come away." The child stopped, looked between the 2 women, and I saw Cora register, in that one taut second, that there was something in this house she didn't yet understand, some line drawn through the middle of it that even a 6-year-old knew not to cross out loud. She didn't know about Nolan yet. She didn't know the line ran right through the supper table. She'd find that out within the hour, and what she did about it would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of my own tally. That's the supper, and the supper is part 2. That afternoon she washed up at the basin behind the house and came back out with the road gone from her face and her dark hair pinned up plain, and she did something none of us expected. She went to work. Not asked to, not told. She walked into that kitchen where Nolan was wrestling supper for 6 out of not quite enough, took in the situation with one look, rolled her sleeves and said, "Tell me what wants doing." And when Nolan only looked at her, that watching look, waiting for the trick in it, Cora picked up a knife and a hill of potatoes and started in on them herself, sat right down at the kitchen table where no white woman in that house had ever sat to share work, and peeled and waited, and did not explain herself. I was hauling water past the window and I saw the exact moment Nolan decided. It wasn't a softening, not yet. Nolan didn't soften for years, and even then only at the edges. It was a kind of careful reappraisal, the look of someone moving a name from one pile to another, provisional, ready to move it back. "The little knife," Nolan said after a long while. "For the eyes, you're leaving half the potato in the bowl." Cora looked at the mangled potato in her hand, looked at Nolan. "And this is the thing I keep coming back to," she laughed. Tired and real at her own bad peeling, in a kitchen full of strangers, with a dead man's grave under the cottonwoods and no idea on God's earth what tomorrow held. "You're right," she said and took the little knife. "Show me how you do it." Hetty, passing the doorway, saw the 2 of them sat at one table with the potato bowl between them, and her face did something I won't try to put into words. She didn't speak. She went out to the porch and stayed there a long while in the going light. I marked it in my book that night the way I mark everything. I wrote Aug. 24, 19 hens lost count of the 20th. Stage came. Brought a widow Sela's never met Mrs. Cora Wickham, told her he's dead. She didn't fall down. And then under it, because I didn't have words yet for what I'd seen in that kitchen, I wrote one more line, S. The table at the Renner place sat 8. But it had never in living memory sat more than 5 at once. That was the first thing Cora got wrong, and the wrongness of it broke the whole house open. Supper came on at full dark. Nolan laid it, a stew stretched thin with potatoes and the last of the salt pork, cornbread, a pitcher of buttermilk gone faintly sour in the heat, and she laid 5 places. 5. Hetty at one end where Sela's used to sit. The 2 children. A place for Cora, the guest. A place for me because I took meals in the house, being the only hand kept on through the lean months. And then Nolan did what she did every single night of her life on that ranch. She filled a plate for herself, and she carried it to the 3-legged stool by the stove, off in the corner where the line of the room said she belonged, and she sat down apart from us to eat alone. Nobody remarked on it. Nobody ever had. It was as much a fixture of that kitchen as the stove itself. Cora stood behind her chair with her hands on the back of it and watched Nolan walk her plate to the corner. And she didn't sit down. The rest of us were already settling. Wesley had his elbows on the table. June was kicking her bare heels against the chair rung. Hetty reached for the cornbread. And Cora just stood there behind her chair, not sitting, looking at the woman in the corner, and the longer she stood the more the room noticed. The way a room notices when one person isn't moving with the rest. "Is something the matter?" Hetty said. "She made all this," Cora said, quiet, not a challenge yet, just a fact said out loud the way she'd said then, "I don't know why I'm here in the yard. Nolan, she made every bit of this supper, and we're going to eat it without her at the table." The room went the particular kind of still that means everyone has understood something at once, and is hopping "it'll pass." "That's how it's done," Hetty said, carefully, like she was explaining the weather to a child. "That's how it's always been done. You're new and you're tired and you've had a terrible shock, so I'll forgive the question, but you'll want to learn quick out here that there are ways things are, for everyone's sake. For hers." "For hers," Cora repeated. "It's not unkind," Hetty said, and I think she even believed it. "She has her place. She's fed, she's housed, my brother saw to her better than most would have. There's no cruelty in it." And Cora said, and I have turned this sentence over in my mind 10,000 times since, because it was so simple and it undid so much. There's no cruelty in a single plate of food. The cruelty's in the corner. Then she pulled out her chair and she didn't sit in it. She picked it up. She carried it around the end of the table, set it down in the open space across from Wesley, and turned to the woman by the stove, and she said, "Nolan, there's a seat here. I'd be glad of the company, and I expect you'd rather not eat your own good cooking next to a hot stove in August. Will you come sit?" I have seen men face down a charging steer with less in them than it took Nolan to lift her eyes off that plate. Because understand, and I didn't understand it myself until I'd watched it cost her, Nolan knew exactly what the offer was. She knew it better than Cora did. To Cora it was a chair. To Nolan it was a line she had survived precisely by never crossing, in a country that had killed people she loved for less. And here was a stranger who'd been in the house 6 hours asking her to step over it in front of Hetty and the children and me, with no notion of who'd be made to pay for it after or how. The trust it took, the terrible arithmetic of it, to weigh a kindness against everything that kindness might bring down on you. She set her plate on the table. She stood, and she crossed the room and sat down in the chair Cora had carried for her, slow and straight-backed and watchful, and the 4 legs of that stool stood empty in the corner for the first time in I don't know how many years. Hetty stood up so fast her chair went over backward. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, and her voice wasn't sharp now. It was scared right down to the bone, and that's when I started to understand there was more under all of it than meanness. You think this is kindness. You think you're doing something fine and Christian, but you don't live here. You don't have to live here after the stage that brought you is long gone. You sit an Apache at your table in this territory and word gets to town, and the next time the men ride out after some raiding party that's got nothing to do with this house, this is the house they remember. You're not just risking yourself. You're risking those children. You're risking her." A hand flung at Nolan. "Did you think of that? In your 6 hours of being so much better than the rest of us, did you think of her at all?" It landed. I saw it land. Cora's face, which had held through the dust and the grave and June's terrible question, finally went white. She turned to Nolan. And what she did then was the bravest thing in the whole story, braver than carrying the chair, because carrying the chair had been easy. It had cost Cora nothing, she understood. This cost her. She turned to Nolan and she said, "Is that true? Have I, by asking you here, have I put you in danger? Because if I have, you stand up right now and you go back to your stool and you forget I ever said a word, and I'll never do it again. I'd rather wrong you than harm you. You tell me. You decide. It's yours to decide and nobody else's. It's yours to decide, in that house," said to that woman. I had never once heard it. And Nalin, who had been watching Cora the way you watch a fire you're not sure of, looked at her for a long, long moment. Then she did something I had not seen her do in all my years there. She smiled. Small. Just at the corner of her mouth. The smile of someone recognizing, against all the evidence of her life, something true. "You ask me," she said. Her. A nod at Hetty, she tells me. Him. A nod at me, and fair enough, he doesn't see me at all. "You ask me." She picked up her spoon. "I'll decide. I decide to eat at the table. The danger was here before tonight. It will be here after. I am tired of meeting it from a stool in the corner." And she ate. It was the quietest supper I ever sat through, and the loudest. Nobody said hardly a word. Hetty picked her chair up off the floor after a while and sat back down, stiff as a board, and ate 4 bites and pushed the rest around her plate. Wesley watched the grown folks with his mouth a little open, working out that the rules he'd been raised inside of could bend, that they were made by people and not by God, which is a dangerous and necessary thing for a boy to learn. June, bless her, was unbothered by any of it. She'd wanted Nalin at the table her whole short life, and saw nothing remarkable in finally getting it. And she chattered on about a lizard she'd seen, until the chatter was the only sound in the room, and somehow made the rest of us able to breathe. And me, I'll tell you what I did. I sat there with my numbers book closed in my lap, and I felt ashamed. Hetty had named it with that one flung sentence. "He doesn't see me at all," and she was right. Nalin was right. I'd shared a roof with that woman for years and counted hens more careful than I'd ever counted her. I'd thought I was a decent man because I was never cruel. I learned that night that not being cruel and actually seeing a person are 2 different countries, and I'd been living in the wrong one and calling it kindness. I didn't say any of that. I'm not a man who says things, but I got up when the meal was done, and instead of leaving the dishes for Nalin the way every one of us always had, I started gathering the plates. And after a second, Wesley got up and helped me. And then, God love her, Hetty got up too, last of all, jaw set, saying not one word, and carried the stew pot to the basin. And the 4 of us cleaned that kitchen together while Nalin sat at the table. She'd finally been asked to, and let herself, for once, be the one who didn't have to. That was the supper. That was the whole of it. A woman moved a chair 8 feet across a room, and a household that had run on one cruel, unexamined rule for years could not, after that night, pretend the rule was God's and not its own. Word did get to town. Hetty was right about that part. It always does. It came back to us inside the week, through a neighbor named Galt, who rode over on a thin excuse about a strayed heifer and spent the whole time looking past us into the house. "Heard you got peculiar notions about who sits where, Miss Renner. Heard you let that bride of poor Silas's turn the place upside down." He said it smiling. The worst ones always smile. I won't pretend there wasn't fear in the house after that. There was. Hetty barely slept. I took to keeping the old Spencer rifle loaded by the kitchen door, and I'd be a liar if I said I didn't lie awake some nights listening to the dark. The territory was what it was, and a thing like Galt's smile had teeth behind it. But here is what I noticed, and what I wrote in my book. The fear didn't break the table. Once a thing like that has happened in a house, it doesn't unhappen. Nalin ate with us every night thereafter. The corner stool got moved out to the porch, and nobody moved it back. And the strange truth was that the fear, instead of driving us apart, packed us in closer, 5 people, and a stranger turning slowly into something the law had no name for, and the territory wanted no part of, but which had started, despite everyone, to act remarkably like a family. What it would cost to keep being one, that was the question the supper hadn't answered. That was still coming. And it came hard in the 3rd part. There was the matter of the marriage paper, and what Cora's name on it did and didn't entitle her to. There was Galt, and the men Galt talked to. And there was a choice Nalin had to make that no one could make for her, the hardest choice in the whole account, and the one I'm least able to write without my hand shaking. Writers. It came in daylight on official paper, which is a thing I've learned the hard way to fear worse than any night rider, because you can shoot at a night rider. A man came out from the county seat in a buggy, a land agent name of Prout, soft-handed, soft-voiced, with a leather case of documents and a way of saying I'm only the messenger, you understand, before he said anything unforgivable. He sat at our table, the one that meant something now, and he laid it out. Silas Renner had died without a proper will. The marriage to Cora had never been performed, so she was no widow and had no dower claim. Hetty was a sister, which counted for something but not enough under the territory's law. A spinster sister's hold on a dead man's property was a thin and challengeable thing. The children were minors. And here was the rub Prout had really driven out to deliver, soft as butter. There were parties, he wouldn't say who, but I'd have laid my whole year's wage on the name Galt, interested in the Renner Grays and the Renner Spring, and inclined to argue before a territorial judge that a household run by a spinster, a strange unmarried woman with no legal standing, and an Indian was no fit guardianship for two white children with valuable land attached. That the children would be best removed to proper relations back east, and the property placed in responsible hands. Prout said responsible hands, the way Galt had said peculiar notions. I watched it go around the table. Hetty went gray. Wesley, who was old enough now to follow it, gripped the edge of the table till his knuckles stood white, the same boy who 3 weeks ago had been all blind anger, gone quiet and frightened, and trying to be a man about it. And June, who didn't understand the words, understood the faces, and climbed into Nolan's lap, and Nolan held her without a word and looked at Prout with eyes that had watched men come with papers to take things before. Cora asked the only useful question. What would make it stop? What's the one thing that takes their argument away? Prout spread his soft hands. A proper, lawful family, a married man and woman settled of good standing with clear claim. A judge can't easily pull children from a stable Christian home with a man at the head of it. He paused, and he had the grace to look a little sick at himself. It's an ugly arithmetic, ma'am, but the law out here counts a household by who's allowed to stand up in it, and as things sit, none of you are allowed to stand up. He left his card and his soft regrets and drove away, and the table sat in silence a long while after the dust of his buggy had settled. Here is where I have to tell the hard part, and I'll tell it plain because Nolan deserves it told plain. In the days that followed, two things became clear, and they pulled against each other like a Greenbrook team. The first was that there was a way to save the children and the land both. A man of standing could marry Cora. Her name on a real paper, a man at the head of the household, a roof a judge would call Christian and fit. It would close the door on Galt and Prout and all of them. There was even a man willing. A decent widowed homesteader 2 valleys over named Coyle, older, kind enough, who'd known Silas and didn't hold with what Galt was doing and had let it be known, careful that he'd stand up with Cora if it'd keep those children where they belonged. It would have been a marriage of arithmetic, not of love, but it would have worked. It would have made the family safe in the only language the territory could read. The second thing was Nolan, because the family the law would protect was a family with no place in it for her. Worse than no place, her presence in the house was the very thing the enemies of it would point to. An Indian raising white children. As long as she was under that roof, she was the loose thread they'd pull. The safest thing for the children, cold and true, was for Nolan to be gone before any judge ever looked at the place. The arithmetic that saved the children erased her from the answer. Nobody said this out loud for 2 days. We all knew it. We circled it. Hetty wouldn't meet Nolan's eye. Cora went around with her jaw set like she was carrying something heavy across a long room and wouldn't put it down. It was Nolan who said it. Of course it was. She'd been doing the territory's terrible arithmetic her whole life. She could do it faster than any of us. She said it to Cora in the kitchen in the evening, and I heard it because I was on the porch mending tack and the window was open, and I have never been able to make myself wish I hadn't heard it. You will marry the Coyle man, Nolan said, And I will go, before the judge, to my mother's people, what is left of them on the reservation land to the north. I have wanted to go and never had a reason that was stronger than the children. Now I have one. If I am gone, you keep them. If I stay, you lose them, and I lose them too, and so does no one win but the men with the papers. A pause. It is the only count that comes out right. And Cora said no. Just that, no, quiet, the way she'd said everything that mattered. It is not yours to refuse, Nolan said, and there was an edge in it. You wanted me to decide. At the table, you said it was mine to decide. This is me deciding. Do not take it back now because you don't like the answer. That stopped Cora cold, because it was fair. It was exactly fair. She had said it was Nolan's to decide, and she'd meant it, and here was the hardest possible test of whether she'd meant it, whether it's yours to decide held when the deciding broke your heart. I'll tell you what Cora did, and it's why I've spent these pages telling you about her at all. She didn't override Nolan. She didn't make the choice for her, the way every other white person in that woman's life had made every choice for her. She honored it. She said, all right. If you choose to go to your people, then you go because you want to go to your people, not because two men with papers ran you off, and not to buy my safety with your leaving. I won't carry the children's safety bought at the price of running you out a back door in the dark like we're ashamed. If you go in daylight, and you go because it's your road, and this family stands in the yard and sees you off like family does. That much I won't bend on. The leaving might be yours. The shame isn't, and I won't take it on, and I won't let them put it on you. Nolan looked at her a long time. And the marriage, she asked, the coil man. And Cora, I heard her draw a breath, the breath of a woman setting down one life and picking up another she never asked for, said, I came out here to marry a stranger to have a place in the world. Seems I'll do it after all, just not the stranger I packed for. A small broken laugh. I'll marry Coyle. I'll keep the children. I'll keep this table. And there'll always be a chair at it with your name on it. And I will tell those two children every year on this day exactly who set this family in motion and what it cost her, so that when they're grown and the law's a little less wicked, they'll know to come find you and bring you home if you'll be brought. She went in the autumn, after the marriage was done and the papers were filed and Prute's soft threats had dried up for lack of a thread to pull. It was a clear, cold morning. Nolan had a horse Coyle gave her, free, in front of witnesses, partly I think because he was a decent man, and partly because Cora made sure there were witnesses, made sure it went down in the county that this was a woman leaving of her own will with property of her own, not a person driven off, so that the record itself would carry a little of the dignity the territory wanted to deny her. Cora thought of things like that. She'd learned the law's language fast, the way you learn the language of a country you've been dropped into without a choice, and she'd turned it, where she could, to shielding the woman it was built to crush. The whole family stood in the yard. Hetty too, Hetty, who'd fought the chair across the room that first night, stood there now with her own eyes wet, and she stepped forward at the last and gripped Nolan's hand hard and said something low I didn't hear, and Nolan nodded. And whatever passed between those two women in that grip was years of something neither of them would ever have a word for. June cried and held the horse's leg until Nolan bent down out of the saddle and said something in her ear that quieted her. Wesley stood straight and didn't cry and shook Nolan's hand like the man he was being forced too soon to become. And Nolan held his hand a beat longer than a handshake and looked at him hard, the way you look at someone you're trusting to remember. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't a woman for speeches. She looked at Cora last from up on the horse, and she said only, you carried a chair across a room. Like that was the whole account of it. Like that was the start and the sum of everything. It was a good supper, Cora said, and her voice didn't hold and she didn't try to make it. Nolan almost smiled. Then she turned the horse north and rode out of the yard and across the flats toward the foothills. And the family Cora had made stood and watched her go the way you watch a storm you can't do anything about. And the dust she raised hung gold in the morning light a long while after she'd gone small in the distance. I had my book out, Force of habit. I meant to write the date and what had happened, the way I write everything down so I won't lose it. I got as far as the date. Then I found I couldn't make the numbers mean anything, and I put the book away, and I just stood there in the yard with the rest of them and watched the road, the way you do when somebody you didn't know you loved goes out of your life in daylight, on her own road, by her own choosing. Which is the most that mean little corner of the world would let us give her, and so much less than she was owed.